Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Today we are joined by Einar Tangen, a senior fellow at the Teihe Institute and the CIGI. So thank you very much for taking the time on a Sunday morning to come on.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's any time to have a conversation with you, Glenn, is always a treat. I mean, there's so much kind of tabloid journalism and kind of s- sophomoric approach to journalism. As we were discussing earlier, you talk to people because you want to understand their point of view and push your point of view, and I applaud you for doing that.
Well, on the topic of journalism, one of the things which haven't really gotten the attention it deserves, at least from my perspective, is the the rising tensions now between China and Japan. That is, there's actual threat of war, and well, we're not there yet, but this is quite surprising turn of event. That is Japan's new prime minister, Takachi, who initiated a very dangerous military escalation, I would say, by announcing these plans to deploy missiles in Taiwan. Now, this is very problematic for many reasons. One, as this is seen as a way of trying to chip away at China's sovereignty over Taiwan, but also indicating that that Japan would be military involved in any possible secessionism. So again, this couldn't be a bigger shining red line that China has, which Japan is crossing, and even she calling Trump. This is interesting. I was just wondering if you can unpack what this is all about and how the mood is over there in Beijing.
All right. First off, I mean, I've talked to people at the ministry and those levels, and they said no. She did not call Trump. It was
Oh,
the other way around. Trump indicated he wanted to have a phone call. She accepted his phone call, and then that went forward. But I think Glenn, to understand this, I think you have to really go back to, uh, you know, rare earths. Donald Trump has a sudden realization that China controls 98% of the rare earths out there in certain categories, especially in these absolutely critical magnets, which are used in these motors, and also gyroscopes, etc. And he realizes, okay, we're dependent on China. That slows his roll on tariffs. He's not happy with it. And he's a bully. He doesn't like to be backed down. So he, arranges to go over and do a sideline meetings, not to be part of the meeting in Busan with the rest of the nations, but simply to meet Xi Jinping. And on the way, what does he do? Stops at three countries. And what is it about? Rare earths. He stops in Vietnam, where they have sources, talks to them, declares victory, goes um, to Malaysia, talks to them. He prior to that, he had had the Australian PM in the office in Washington, talking about this new commitment to rare earths. And then he shows up in Japan, and then he goes to Busan. So at each one of those stops, it's all about rare earths, really nothing else. And what he's trying to do is build up this idea that, look, if you don't give me the rare earths, I will create my own supply chain. The only problem with that, as we've discussed before, is it would take 5 to 7 years just to to create enough volume to satisfy America's strategic need in terms of missiles, defense, etc. And it would take 10 to 15 years to take care of the civilian use. So no cars, nothing that you can actually use with a computer chip in it or anything like that. So, and then there's this absurd moment. I love this. Donald Trump immediately said, I'm not going to sell you, Boeing is not going to sell you any avionics. All right. And avionics are something that the Chinese have to import. They don't have their own set. I'm sure they're working on it. But these are the control systems for their jets, and they have a domestic jet program, and they have to import the avionics from Boeing. So he says, "Oh well, we'll use this as a stick." Well, here's the irony: you won't be able to make those avionics if you don't have the rare earths and critical metals. that are necessary to make them. So in essence, he's saying, we're not going to give you this stuff we can't make. And it just kind of passed over everybody's heads, the absurdity of it. But this is exactly what he's doing. So when he goes to Japan, um, he shows there they have a meeting with Takahashi. It's all friendly and everything like that. But I'm almost certain that he told her, he said, gave her a green light on making mischief with China. Why? Because it's classic Trump tactics. When he can't get directly, he tries to get indirectly. He's been stirring up trouble in the stands. This whole thing where he said he declared victory and he created peace between Azerbaijan and um, uh, the other country I can't remember at the moment.
Armenia, yeah.
And then also, he said, "Oh, I'm going to create a roadway along the periphery of these things," as if you could do that without Iran's cooperation. Um, but just to stir things up there, and he's stirring it up certainly in the Philippines, and then here's Japan, and it coincided. If you study prime minister's history, it's interesting. She's very ambitious. She comes from a middle class family. She proclaims traditional Japanese values. For instance, she says, there should only be one name, but she doesn't add in that. In her case, she married a fellow politician on a different political persuasion. They had 4 kids. They divorced. She never took his name. And then when they remarried, he took her name. So not exactly a traditional Japanese approach. So I think it's indicative that she just uses situations that are advantageous to herself. She's proclaimed that she wants to be known as the Margaret Thatcher of Japan, kind of an iron lady. So, it suits her very well. And domestically, for the moment, it is working. She has 74% approval rating among the Japanese people. She took a very stern stance towards foreigners. Obviously, China, in retaliation, said, "Look, we're going to withdraw a lot of our people." Just said, "Don't go there." Almost 500,000 people said, "Okay, we're canceling our flights and our vacations there. It's going to hit Japan hard." Uh, but there had been a kind of an overload on tourism, and tourism was, like one of the second largest breadwinners coming in. Well, fourth actually, but after machinery and electronic goods, then you have cars, and then you have tourism. It's a big bite, and there's going to be repercussions for that. So short term, she's gotten some popularity, but long term, she doesn't have an economic plan. If you look very closely and study what she has proposed, it's Abenomics, except no structural change. She believes that the problem is that the government hasn't taken enough control over the message. So what she's saying is the Japanese economy should use, spend money like it's a drunken sailor, and then just try to convince people that everything's fine. And I don't know that that's going to work in reality. You start looking at the numbers, you can already see that Japan is headed towards a recession. And when that hits, the reality of a hard-pressed Japan, which are already suffering demographic issues, and basically have been going sideways since 1985, 86, when they signed the Plaza Accords under U.S. pressure. You start looking at that, and the future looks very bleak.
Yeah, well, she's a nationalist, though, but in Japan, that often translates into a bit more anti-China sentiments. Nonetheless, I did suspect, well, I do suspect that the United States, well, is pushing for this, or at least doing it in cooperation, because it doesn't seem like Japan would take such a massive move. I mean, this is not ambiguous language about the future status of Taiwan. This is, talking about sending missiles to Taiwan. And there's only one way they would be used. That is if Taiwan declare independence. That is to officially secede from China. This is the trigger that would start China to take military action. But so this is this is not just encouraging them, but this is also signaling that Japan will participate. Well, if not directly, then use Taiwan as a proxy, which is why it's interesting to see if not just Taiwan but Japan could be set up as another Ukraine, if you will, another proxy. But do you see this as simply being the United States trying to uh, use the military or military pressure, political pressure, as the economic war isn't going its way, or do you think there could actually be a deliberate pathway to war? Because I would think that if a war would ensue, that this would be more of a miscalculation that is trying to use secession as a military pressure in order to get China to bend on some of the some of its economic stance instead. But how are you assessing the I guess the intentions of the United States here?
Well, I think you have to think of it this way. Donald Trump is playing for leverage, all right? But he's playing a very dangerous game, scripting back and forth across red lines. And that could lead to a situation, a Chinese or Japanese warship, has a direct encounter with a Chinese warship. They sail into disputed waters and an exchange of gunfire, people die, and you start to have, escalatory retaliation. That's the accidental enter into war. That's World War II. I don't think that, Trump is playing the part of Hitler in the sense that he's planning things. He talks a lot about annexations and things like this, and I think he will try to do a decapitation strike in Venezuela. But he's not really. He's a bully. He doesn't want to go up against anybody he thinks is equal or superior to him. Using Japan as a proxy, I completely agree with you, but it's dangerous because the US gets pulled in if there's in fact any kind of kinetics. And what is the response going to be if he backs away from it? I mean, that's the end. American credibility, the nuclear umbrella, all this kind of stuff disappears. If he goes ahead with it, we're risking the destruction of the world as we know it. So, I mean, he's really playing with fire. She's playing along because she doesn't have an economic plan, as I said. She's a very complex lady. And I think under the circumstances, we could back into this not by design, but by accident. On China's part, I say for me, it seems very clear that they're playing for time. I mean, we've just had less than a year of Donald Trump, and as I've said before, it's like living as a dog. Every day seems like a week. Every year seems like 7 years. He has so many pronouncements. He tells so many outrageous things on a daily basis. So many lies. It's really hard to separate everything, and what happens is he says, "Oh, you're always against me. Everything I say, you're against." And therefore, he tries to paint the picture that anybody who actually asks him questions, as we've seen during White House press conferences, or when he does candid moments, he just says, "Oh, you're nasty. You're incompetent. You're stupid." All these kinds of stuff. This is kind of stuff I would expect out of the playground from an 11-year-old. But it's working for him for now. But on both sides, US and Japan, weakness is the reality of economies.
Yeah, I there seems to be this common theme though, that is the U.S. whenever it makes any deals or goes and shake hands, that it never goes after a new status quo as the source of peace. Everything seems like a temporary ceasefire, which you then essentially just regroup. We saw this with Iran. When they declare an end to the hostilities, it's more, well, things aren't going well. Let's plan ahead. And also, it's been a common theme with Russia for the past 30 years. Whenever there's been, problems in the pushback from Moscow, we shake hands to just get over this difficult spot. And of course, over the past 11 years, it's been um, more and more. Now that there's been more actual hot war, then we see that this use of peace treaties, all of this, just as a temporary way of changing realities on the ground. But it seems like this is something that China is also coming to terms with. But in terms of the mood in Beijing, though, to what extent would this influence the Chinese government? Because this can't be very popular among the Chinese public. Like, where's the biggest pushback coming? Is it the government? Is it public? Or how are you assessing this?
It's both. You have to keep in mind this is the 80th anniversary of the Nanjing massacre and the end of the fascist war of occupation, which is Japan. 35 million Chinese people died directly or indirectly because Japan was taking, literally starved to death because China was taking, Japan was taking food to fund their war effort to do that. And then you had the forced labor camps, the comfort women, and the indiscriminate killing. So there have been a lot of movies, there have been a lot of documentaries. I went to the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Museum in Nanjing, and I can tell you, people feel very, very strongly about this. I mean, this is something that touched not very many people directly because of the age, but through parents, even grandchildren will tell you. I was at a dinner party, and this gentleman, a renowned scholar from Tsinghua, was saying, "Look, my great uncle was beheaded by the Japanese. He was in a village. He wasn't able to leave. They killed him." And he said, "My mother was in Nanjing during the rape of Nanjing. She narrowly escaped." She said she was part of a school that was protected by a foreigner. Um, but many of the women around her were, in fact, raped. And many of them ended up committing suicide to the shame and the disgrace of it. So this is a raw moment in time, and then to have somebody like a Takaishi, not only resurrecting this idea that they have some sort of extraterritorial claims or ability to determine outcomes that they agreed not to pursue. There have been 4 treaties between Japan and China. The first 2, one was in 1972 and then a follow-up in 92, 78, I'm sorry. And those, didn't say, "Oh, maybe Taiwan's part of China." They recognize there's only one China. And they were also, part of the United Nations. They did not vote against it. It was clear that there's only one China. And then they signed in 98 and 2008, they signed treaties that said, look, any disputes that we have or anything about territory and things we will discuss. Instead, she went to the press. I'm certain that the question was planted. Sorry, I'm so cynical, but I was involved in politics, and I don't think it was just happenstance that this happened. So, this was something very deliberate. It was something, obviously, and I completely agree with you. There is no way any prime minister thinks that they can go out on a limb and destroy this idea of ambiguity regarding Taiwan. This is not uh, Japan's issue, any way, shape, or form. They had conquered Taiwan and held it uh, against all comers until the end of the war, and it was taken away from them. So it's not like this is part of their territory or anything like this. So I mean, this is just pure calculation, and as you said, or we discussed, the danger here is not that you have a war by design, but that you have a war by accident. And then, American Washington and Trump's ambivalence because, oh, it's like Ukraine, we're weakening China. Well, it didn't work then. I watched one of your previous shows yesterday, and it was talking about the lack of strategy, and not just in the United States, but also in Europe vis-a-vis Ukraine. Well, we have the same thing happening here in the East. You have America kind of pushing things around, but there is absolutely no end game in sight. And any kind of kinetic war is almost impossible. We're talking about moving troops across the Pacific. Not going to happen, not in large numbers. Yes, uh, U.S. has bases around the area, 400 to be exact, or just under. But those could easily be targeted by a much larger force. China is here. U.S. is not. And, any kind of proxy between war between Japan and China isn't going to work out well for Japan. I don't, they don't have a standing army that's capable of doing what? Invading Taiwan, coming to its defense? They would never get very far. Their ships would be intercepted. I mean, the warfare reality, given that you have hypersonic missiles, which cannot be defended against at this point, and you have drones that unmanned that can go almost everywhere and have defenses, but they get through. So under those kind of realities, this idea that you can fight, the World War II again is nonsense. It's not going to go anywhere, and it bothers me that there is no thinking whatsoever, no talk in Washington about what the long term goal is, other than let's contain China because that will help us.
Yeah, a key concern for mine is that we've lost all the respect and fear of war. That is, the past generation who actually experienced proper war in the West. They are all passed away, or most of them have passed away. And this is one of the things that it seems every generation has to learn on its own. And indeed, over the past 30 years, we see what the new generation of politicians think of war, because over the past 30 years, war means that we have a powerful air force with powerful weapons, and we fly over small to medium-sized countries and bomb them and defeat them. But war is something that
Did we
happens
defeat
far.
them?
Huh?
Did we defeat any of them? That's the real
Okay,
question.
that is fair.
Okay.
That is fair.
Yes. I I I mean, how is it that 30 to 40,000 Taliban troops were able to defeat the entire might of NATO and the United States? That tells you that things have turned asymmetric and they're in favor of local entities who have the willpower to continue fighting.
Victory, yeah, that would be an exaggeration. I guess that's one of the key themes of these forever wars, is that they don't actually end in victory. But part of it is also strategy. No one really defines what victory entails. It's just to keep it going. But given that war is not something that happens on our own soil anymore, it has created a very casual relationship to war. War is not something you fear anymore, that it will bring devastation to your own country and kill your own neighborhood and your own family. But of course, we're moving now away from this post-Cold War era of bombing smaller, medium-sized countries. That is, we saw this with Ukraine as well. The idea that, why should the war be limited to Ukraine? We should bring the war to Russia. No one asks the question whether or not the Russians then will be able to bring the war to us. I mean, this is kind of wild stuff. Same as China. If you go to war against China, this will not be limited to fighting on Chinese soil or in Taiwan. The idea that you have escalation control, it's a very dangerous illusion, because this will spin out of control very, very fast. But yeah, this is my concern, that we're gonna have to learn about great wars again. But given the weapons we have now, it's not really a lesson we can afford to learn. Um, yeah, to learn again.
But Glenn, what do you think about? I mean, the economic realities seem overwhelming. I mean, you're already hearing reports from Western sources, New York Times, et cetera, saying that the United States is not making any progress in reindustrializing. You had the UNDP saying, by 2030, China will 45% of the world's production, and the United States 11%. Then you start adding in the resources necessary to do this. I just don't understand. There doesn't seem to be any calculation about it. They cannot pursue the war in Ukraine because they cannot produce enough weapons, ammunition, I should say, to do it. And yet, you still have these people, mouthing these slogans. The only way this will be decided is on the battlefield. That was the European Union. Something I never thought I would ever hear from the EU. They certainly don't say things like that when it involves conflicts in Africa or South America or Asia. How do you see this? I struggle to try to understand exactly what, if there's any formula whatsoever.
Oh, well, I think the major panic is and the limits of what's possible solutions to any conflict is that the foundational assumption that there has to be international order based on the continued leadership of the West. I mean, once this goes away, this centuries-old power distribution goes away, that then it's too much uncertainty. So I think they're willing to look the other way for many things. That is conflict with China, the war against Russia, but even you heard the German comments when the Israelis, unleashed their military fury across the region. That is, the Chancellor Merz said, "Well, the Israelis are doing dirty work for us." I think step one is just to restore the world as it was under liberal hegemon, as well as they can call it, and then thereafter we can start to worry about the smaller things. But this idea that can live with China as being the leading economy, it's almost unthinkable to these people. It's like what Hillary Clinton said. She doesn't want her grandchildren to grow up in a world where China is the leading economy. It's not gonna happen. So this is kind of the dangerous mentality I think they're stuck with. If they could change, accept that the world would is already in a multipolar phase, that Russia is a country, largest country in Europe. It does have a seat, should have a seat at the table. It's not a hegemonic. If we accept that China is at least in purchasing power parity the largest economy, we're gonna have to accept a world where we live side by side. I think a lot of possible solutions would open up, but I think we closed ourselves off so far. That is, yeah, essentially ignoring reality as it is. Now, if you ignore reality as it is, it creates a lot of pressure to do some massive changes, and I think that's our main mistake. But you mentioned the economic war is not going as it was supposed to. The U.S. is not able to, well, put a significant dent in China, but also America itself is not reindustrializing. The Chinese uh, getting more control of their own supply chains. The U.S. is not. China's advancing with its technologies. But you also hear now, well, not just here, you see these reports of all these different billionaires, be it the Buffetts or the Bezos, the Mark Zuckerbergs, who are now beginning to take out a lot of cash that is selling their stocks. And usually, when you see these kind of things, you assume that they know something you don't know, that they are, you see an economic crisis coming your way. So you are, yes, selling off your stocks so you can buy them on the cheap when everything crashes. Um, do you see any, do you see this factoring into the growing tensions now?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's okay, so NVIDIA, $5 trillion valuation. I don't even know how there's no way that they're gonna reach those kind of, sales or anything like that that would support that. Uh, their insiders are selling like crazy. It's been, billions of dollars worth of stock. That should be a bellwether to, people on the street, but instead, they're focused on whether or not the Fed is going to, give an interest rate cut, as if that somehow solves the economic problems that are existing there. And obviously, in my opinion, it does not. So, you have these kind of unreal situations being driven by fluff. And it's very, very similar to 2008, 2009, the economic meltdown. Unfortunately, then this one will be worse. The U.S. was not, so many trillions of dollars in debt, and they, we were still in a situation where we could be effective in the world. We were still a leading power. The G20 was effective. Today, the G20, minus basically the U.S., which has abdicated any kind of participation, is now becoming increasingly irrelevant. The only way it can reclaim relevancy is literally to kick the U.S. out and say, well, the rest of us agree. And quite frankly, we're bigger than the U.S. Collectively. Maybe it's time that we turn the tables and go to Washington and say, look, knock this stuff off. We don't care how much you charge your own people in terms of tariffs, but you're not going to pit us against each other in some sort of cynical colonial game where we have to vie for your favor by, giving your children new deals or, they're just giving face to whatever nutty crap you want to put out there. And I'm sorry to use those terms, but I mean, I can't imagine how else you can describe what is going on. We have a world which just doesn't make any kind of sense. When Donald Trump is willy nilly, you give $40 billion to Argentina because it's his friend, right? And he'll put 50% tariffs on Brazil. Why? Because his friend is being, tried to overturn the election, is being punished for it. I mean, this idea that politics is personal. We've returned to the days of imperial times. This is the kind of talk that you'd hear prior to the First World War. How the Kaiser was tired of his grandmother's country, not allowing them to rape, rob, and pillage in Africa, and it was their right to do that. If they don't, give in, there's going to be war. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense, and we're supposedly past that, but we're not. And in terms of how it all ends up, well, the U.S. is not in a position. They have not been able to defeat Russia in Ukraine. The idea that they can defeat Russia and China simultaneously is even more absurd. And I go back to this thing: we weren't able to defeat the Taliban, 30 to 40,000, fighters in over 20 years. We weren't able to do anything, and now we turned it back to um, it's just we're going in circles. There's no strategy. There's this desire to return to the past. And I think it's the worst kind of silliness that you can swim in the same river twice. You can't. You change, and the water flows down. And Donald Trump is trying to sell that dream to an American public who is completely alienated by their own political system, which has, since 1972, when there was 61% of the population, which was middle class. Last year, it was only 40%. So you see the setting. Now they'll say, "Oh, well, there's a number of people who made it in upper middle class." Well, not as many who then degraded into being, and that is continuing. And I forecast and what you're going to see is that domestic troubles in both Japan and the United States are catching up with them. This is going to be a cold Thanksgiving. And when the credit card bills arrive, it's going to get colder. Then we're heading into Christmas. And it's going to be a dismal Christmas. And when it happens and people start getting their credit card bills and they're unable to pay, already you've had what? A huge uptick, 7% of the people are going and buying groceries on I'll buy now and pay later. Well, pay later plus interest. That's how desperate they are. They've run through all their credit lines. They don't have any cash and they need food and they're borrowing to buy it. This is not a country that's on the up and up. He's, in essence, doing away with this whole Medicare program. Millions of 30 million people are going to face huge higher budgets. I mean, bills, premiums. They're not going to be able to afford them. They're going to slip all out of the healthcare system, which means they'll be showing up in emergency rooms. It doesn't mean you get rid of the cost. Actually, you make the cost worse. This is one of the main arguments that was for creating affordable healthcare is because you can manage it and keep the costs lower than rather than having people show up at emergency rooms. So the United States is heading on a dismal path. Japan, especially, if you start looking at their situation, which is, I mean, most of the pundits keep talking about a 20% exposure, but 25% of the imports that Japan has is from China. And those imports, a lot of them are intermediate goods, which are absolutely necessary to put into other products, which then are used domestically, but most of them are exported. Talking about car parts, chemicals, rare earth elements, certain types of metals, things like this. And then you start add in what they're getting from ASEAN. Because over these last years, ASEAN has taken a lot of Chinese businesses, which are now doing there. That's 100 billion. It's about 110 billion on the Chinese side, 100 billion on ASEAN. You add them together, then you add in what's happening with seafood, what's happening with tourism, and how all these things come together. You're talking about a country that was estimated in September to have maybe a 1.1% GDP growth. This quarter alone could sink that. And then in 6 months, you could see Japan slipping into a very strong depression. She's not willing to walk back her statements. Beijing is not willing to take the pressure off until she does. So we're between a rock and a hard place. I hope it doesn't come to that, but it's just really, really difficult because Donald Trump, he might be saying to her, he says, cool it down a little bit, but he's not saying stop it. He loves this. He loves being in the center light. He loves it because Xi Jinping will accept his call. He loves it because he gets to call, the prime minister of Japan and tell her to do what he wants her to do. This is the kind of limelight that he loves. His strategy is to create a problem and then try to figure out how he can benefit from it. Come in and pretend he's a savior. This is, constant. You see this, even on his reality show, The Apprentice. What does he do? He sets them silly or impossible tasks, and then goes through and criticizes them because they didn't achieve them. But remember, it was his task. If it's a failure, should put a lot of it on the taskmaster himself, and that's what we have today. Donald Trump running around playing, same game that he was playing when he was doing reality TV. This is real life, and people are dying.
Yeah, well, this is my concern. That is when the United States decides to, transition from the small wars to going to war with the great powers. It's not going to do so directly because a direct war between the great powers, the nuclear powers, is not a good idea. So it will use the proxies, which is why the Ukraine war was started. But it also, if you start to see America's proxies in the region, that is Taiwan or Japan, take this kind of change their rhetoric and take this kind of actions. I mean, Taiwan's leadership, then yeah, there's reason for concern. But when an economic war goes wrong and one escalates into the military sphere, I think this is why this process, it feels like this is possibly where we're at now, which is why it's important not just to look at the military tensions, but the economic conflict, which is fueling this. However, my last question is just how you see Europe playing into this, because the U.S. China economic war is one thing, but the Europeans have begun to lean in. Most well known with the Nexperia case. My last question is just, how do you see the recent development now? Because yeah, that saga isn't over. It looked like the Dutch were gonna walk this one back, but now they are looking at the diversifying a bit away from China. So they're again, it's not accepting status quo, peace. Instead, there's now a temporary ceasefire. It seems to regroup and be better prepared for a direct economic war with China.
Well, do you blame the puppet master or the puppet? Quite frankly, neither withdrawing the ASML. These are the yeah, X-ray lithography that basically they etch the silicon that allows these smaller and smaller chips. Taking that off the market was not something that the Dutch wanted to do. That was a huge source of revenue. And then you have this. Why are they doing it? Simply because Washington is putting pressure on them to do it. I don't know exactly what kind of pressure they can bring to bear. But obviously, it's been successful. This is not to the Netherlands' advantage economically. What they're going to take on China. I don't even know what that means. It just means they lose their exports to China. And China, to anything like ASML already, the Chinese have figured out ways to get around that. They can speed up chips by using legacy chips and then putting together in new ways. They already announced that the day before yesterday that they can use 14 nanometer chips, which they have a huge advantage on because they're one of the major producers. And they can make chips that are as fast as the 4 nanometer chips that are being put out and less expensive. So you tell me if you want performance, well, if you can buy it at a lower price. And this is the problem that the Netherlands have, and also Europe. Question of ability to compete. U.S. successfully, in essence, cut off a reliable source of cheap energy, Russian gas. Whether you think it's deliberate or not, or was part of this, the fact is the United States was never, ever going to allow Europe to get together with Russia. If they did, Russian resources, European manufacturing would be a peer competitor and maybe even the superior competitor to the United States. But we don't allow that. We didn't allow that with Japan, didn't allow that with Europe. And we're trying to do this exact same thing to China. We don't change our ideas. It's kind of this weird mixture of Kissinger's idea that great powers stay great by using their power asymmetrically to enforce against anybody who challenges it. And then this secondary idea that somehow America is this shining city on a hill. Where is the light coming from? Obviously from God, the destiny, whatever you want to call it. So they're marrying these two ideas together. So there's no rationality. Everything is justified because we're anointed by God. And the second part is, in order to keep our power, we have to do, some fairly nasty things, but it's all justified in the end because it's the greater good. But in this case, strategy, as you pointed out, it's out the window. Rationality doesn't work. I mean, the economics don't even make sense. And there just really is no goal other than stay, playing king of the hill. And this is really where things have gone and are going to continue to go. There's no out for any of this stuff as long as Washington believes American exceptionalism as a rationale for doing the kind of realpolitik things that they have done in the past and continue to do.
Yeah, it's well with the Europeans. So I mean, there can't be any doubt that the Dutch were acting under U.S. pressure. It was the response to this 50% rule, but even the media has reported from Netherlands that the Dutch were under great pressure from the United States. That if you want to trade with the U.S., then you have to take these very drastic, aggressive moves against the Chinese. It is. I think the Europeans they're in a very difficult spot now, but some of it's in their minds as well because there's a reluctance to accept that they have become a proxy. That is, after centuries of the world being Eurocentric, that means the world was Europe's chessboard. It was Europeans who could sit at the table, move the pieces around. Um, there was some extension on life of this format after World War II by partnering up with the United States, but there's no acceptance that Europe has now become a piece to be moved around at the table. The assumption that that Europe is still sitting next to the U.S. and we are essentially organizing the world around us. They still want this to be the reality. So they still want the 90s to come back. And for all these warnings from Macron and others for years that Europe should not become a proxy of America. We need a strategic autonomy. This is all gone now. And now that it's actually happened, that Europe is a proxy, there's no other way to look at it. There's no sovereignty or autonomy anymore. It does what America says, and America tells us to do things, which puts us even more exposed position. That is, cut yourself off from China, only deal with America, and the Europeans still think that they're going to be rewarded by America, but all by committing ourselves only to the US, putting all our eggs in that basket. But the only thing that happens is more dependence on the US, and the US can now dictate exactly what it wants. So we're doing everything the opposite of what we should. So instead of diversifying, we're just, building up to this excessive dependence.
But my problem with this is I agree with everything you said, but if rational minds were looking at this, there's an obvious solution. Get together, if the EU and BRICS and ASEAN and all these kind of Mercosur, everything like this, they don't have to build a platform and get together, do anything. All they need to do is get a group of representatives, go to the White House, tell Donald Trump it's over. We're not doing your bidding. It's a multipolar world. Europe chooses to be part of that. We don't want to be bullied by you anymore. And, you can do whatever you want to do. You can isolate yourself. You can tax your people to death. You can do anything you want, but we're not going to be part of it. And if you try, all right, we will start taxing your services, putting tariffs on them. We'll tariff your goods. Remember, the United States is still the second largest exporter in the world, and we'll cut you off. And, Donald Trump, being who he is, would taco. Trump always chickens out. And this you can rely on. He when a bigger bully appears or somebody stands up to him, they get rewarded. You know, we were talking earlier about the difference between Zelensky, who was dependent on the US, and Zohan, who's in New York, right? Couldn't be it's night and day. He calls Trump a fascist in the Oval Office, right? And Trump is laughing about it. Meanwhile, he was excoriating, Zelensky because Zelensky said, "Well, we don't want to do that because you don't have the cards." So, you look at Russia. He hasn't been able to bully Russia into anything, and he's always saying, "Oh, Putin's my friend." Does the same thing with China. So, I'm hoping that Europe will suddenly realize that you're better off being Trump's enemy than you are his friend, because he treats his friends like dirt. All right. At least as your enemy, you're going to get some respect. Use your leverage. Stand up. It's time that Europe wakes up from this kind of dream state, as you described it, that they're the wingman for the United States in this great, liberal order. The liberal order has collapsed. It doesn't exist anymore in the fashion that they want it. So when you have an alternative that is so simple, it seems kind of odd that they're not availing themselves to it. I've talked to people in India who had an opportunity to do that. I've talked to people in Europe and South America. I said, why aren't you just coming together? You don't have to have a new UN. You don't have to name yourself as a group. You just send representatives from each side and you just tell the US this is the way it's going to be. And that's the end of it. And Donald Trump would have no choice. He's already facing huge domestic problems, any pressure on him, and all of a sudden, you know, I can foresee it now. "Oh, you guys are my friends," whoever the representatives, "Oh, I like you, you're a decent guy," all this kind
Yeah.
of stuff. And but I mean, how else can you express it? You tell me anybody who's been nice to him, who's been rewarded, and I'm serious. Name one,
No, no, he's
right?
the president of low-hanging fruit, and if you can make a little threat and then have everyone bow and do what he wants, this is the ultimate, peace through strength, which he keeps looking for. Just but no, no, I very much agree. But I think that the Europeans could begin to adjust and actually, yeah, try to survive. But as long as our war against Russia continues, America is as the main security provider, let's call it security provider, everything will be subordinated to this. So the security dependence on the US can be converted to any political, geoeconomic loyalties acting against their own national interests. So my great hope is that that the proxy war against Russia would come to an end, and hopefully that would open up some room for maneuver for the Europeans to, yeah, restore some political autonomy, economic autonomy, and hopefully some dignity and self-respect, as well as it's been a sad sight over the past few years to see what's happening to this continent. But so any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Oh, and I think we're heading for the perfect storm. This is unrelated in the sense that you have Japan, one of the largest holders of U.S. treasuries. You have the U.S., piling on more debt, and then they're creating these artificial vehicles like stable coins, which are just a way of selling more treasuries. to make up for the fact that everyone else is selling their treasuries. Smart, but central banks, the people that you were talking about in terms of Buffett and all the rest of these guys, they're not investing in treasuries. And, Donald Trump at some point is going to try to press both. Next August he gets he'll get his own Fed guy in there, and you can see rates decreasing at the same time as he tries to drive the value of the dollar down to make U.S. Exports more viable. But then that could abandon the dollar. So we're looking at real economic turmoil, and the fact that Japan and the US are involved and that they would be dominoes in this economic decline is really disturbing.
I agree very much. So thank you so much for taking the time again. And yeah, I feel a little bit wiser. So thank you.